Some films don't build worlds, they actually conjure them. They arrive fully formed with a sense of purpose so concentrated that you feel it before you understand it. The air feels different, the rhythm shifts, the images look as if they were carved rather than shot, shaped by hands that knew exactly what they wanted to leave behind. And then a performance appears at the center of it all that doesn't behave like a performance. It doesn't feel presented or heightened. It feels lived, shaped by conviction, sharpened by doubt, carried by something deeper than character psychology. It includes something closer to internal pressure rather than expression. It was at the moment that I realized this that I understood I wasn't watching a biopic. I was watching belief take cinematic form. The question is, will you feel the same once you watch the movie analyzed in this review? Well, I hope you do, and in this episode, I'm going to give you some ideas and notions that you can digest before you watch or rewatch one of Fastvold's latest title. I'm Peter from Vinyl N Celluloid, and this is my review of The Testament of Anne Lee. Now, there are movies that tell stories, and there are movies that feel carved from the raw materials of cinema itself. The Testament of Anne Lee belongs firmly in the second category. From its opening images, Fastvold makes it clear that biography is only scaffolding. What she's constructing is something far more immersive. A work where bodies, movement, sound, and ritual converge into a sensorial experience that feels elemental rather than illustrative. It isn't a reenactment of history, mind you, it's a cinematic seance, and its arrival feels particularly resonant now. After all, we live in a moment where belief is either commodified, aestheticized, or immediately flattened into irony. Faith on screen is often treated as pathology, spectacle, or shorthand for horror. Rarely is it approached as something lived, something embodied, without condescension or sensationalism. The film's director chooses the harder path. She doesn't explain belief. She doesn't reassure the viewer with easy moral framing. She simply allows faith to exist as a force that shapes space, behavior, hierarchy, and identity, and trusts the audience to sit with that experience rather than decode it. But what's really remarkable about this title isn't that it overwhelms, it's that it achieves its power so quietly. There's no grand flourish, no visual excess designed to impress, just clarity of vision, carried out with patience and discipline. But before going any further, and as per usual, here's a brief recap about what the Testament of Anne Lee is about. Set in the 18th century, the Testament of Anne Lee follows Anne Lee, the spiritual leader who becomes a central figure of the Shaker movement, a religious community defined by communal labor, strict discipline, celibacy, and a radical rethinking of gender roles. As persecution intensifies and belief hardens into identity, Anne's role expands beyond leadership. She becomes symbol, conduit, and vessel, a human body carrying an ideal larger than itself. The film traces not only the transformation of a community, but the transformation of a person into doctrine, and the emotional and psychological cost of said transformation. And I think at this point, it's important to understand what kind of film this actually is. For the Testament of Anne Lee is not interested in explanation. It doesn't guide the viewer towards conclusions or often verdicts on faith. It works through accumulation rather than revelation. Meaning emerges through rhythm, repetition, texture, and physical presence rather than narrative escalation. In fact, watching the film feels less like following a plot and more like entering a system, one governed by its own internal logic, where devotion is expressed through labor, song, silence, and disciplined movement. The film doesn't rush to justify itself. It asks the viewer to adjust their attention, to listen differently, to recognize patterns before interpreting them. Cinema itself becomes a form of ritual here. Sound doesn't just decorate the image, it shapes space. Silence isn't absence, it's pressure. The grain of film stock, the weight of candlelit interiors, the cold reach of winter landscapes, all of it contributes to a sensory environment that feels tactile and inhabited. Even the passage of time feels altered, measured not by plot beats, but by cycles of work, rest, and repetition. Director Fastvold doesn't ask us to agree with this world, she only asks us to witness it. Once that lens is in place, the film's individual elements begin to lock together. And the first of those elements is vitality, something period dramas often struggle to achieve. Too many historical films treat the past like a museum space, embalming it in reverence and stillness. Everything looks beautiful, but nothing feels alive. History becomes an aesthetic rather than an experience. The filmmaker rejects that instinct entirely. Her shaker community feels restless and charged with purpose. Communal routines aren't background texture, they're motion. Labor organizes bodies, repetition structures days, and rituals aren't symbolic shorthand. They're the architecture of daily life. In this context, history isn't reconstructed, it's re entered. Austerity doesn't translate to stasis. Discipline doesn't erase motion. And within repetition, the director finds variation. Within restraint, she finds tension. The absence of conventional narrative escalation isn't a lack, but rather a condition. With drama emerging not from plot mechanics, but from the accumulated tension, from the slow realization that order itself can become expressive. Space in this film doesn't simply contain belief, it's shaped by it. Rooms feel calibrated to behavior. Thresholds matter. Silence enforces hierarchy. The environment itself is not neutral, it participates. And at the center of this carefully structured world is Amanda Seyfried delivering a performance defined by gravity rather than display. Her Anne Lee doesn't perform belief, but rather carries it. Authority is physical before it's verbal. It lives in posture, stillness, breath. Seyfried understands that leadership in this context doesn't announce itself. It radiates, quietly but unmistakably. This isn't a performance built on speeches or emotional crescendos. The actress allows doubt to surface only in brief fractures. A hesitation before movement, a glance held too long, a momentary softening that quickly seals itself shut. When certainty wavers, it feels seismic, precisely because it's been so tightly contained. And what's remarkable is how much of the performance is communicated through stillness. Seyfried often appears motionless, yet never inert. The body becomes a site of control, of tension held in reserve. Even when Anne Lee says nothing, her presence alters the behavior of others in the room. People adjust their posture, the rhythm changes, authority reshapes the space around her. Anne Lee is, after all, a woman elevated by belief and simultaneously imprisoned by it. The actress never plays her as a saint or tyrant, but she does play her as someone slowly disappearing into the role the world requires her to inhabit. As Anne Lee's authority grows, her humanity becomes increasingly compressed. Seyfried plays this not as a triumph or tragedy, but as weight, the quiet cost of becoming indispensable to a collective identity. The performance suggests a person who no longer has the luxury of private doubt, whose interior life must remain sealed for the system to function. Anne Lee becomes less a protagonist than a vessel. Belief takes residence in a body that no longer fully belongs to itself. But if belief inhabits bodies in this film, it finds its clearest expression through movement and sound. The musical sequences are not departures from the narrative. They are the most concentrated form. Drawn from Shaker hymns, these moments do not function as spectacle or release in the traditional cinematic sense. They emerge organically from the community. Voices rise together, bodies align, rhythm builds. Meaning accumulates through repetition rather than explanation. What begins as a structured movement gradually becomes something more ambiguous. The line between devotion and compulsion blurs. There is joy here, but it's inseparable from discipline. Energy surges, but always within strict boundaries. The repetition of words and gestures transforms them, stripping them of individuality and turning them into collective expression. Fastvold films these sequences without irony or distance. The camera does not comment on them, it participates. The audience is not instructed how to feel, only invited to experience the momentum as it builds and releases. The choreography is precise but not ornamental. The music is expressive but never indulgent. These scenes don't exist to dazzle, they exist to externalize inner life, to make belief visible as motion. They don't illustrate faith, they enact it. Cinema stops representing ritual and becomes ritual itself. And this commitment to sincerity is what makes the film so quietly unsettling. The Testament of An Lee refuses to frame belief as either salvation or pathology. Fastvold withholds judgment, and in doing so, allows conviction to reveal its full complexity. The Shaker's devotion is sincere. Their contradictions are visible. Their certainty is sometimes beautiful, sometimes oppressive. The film does not resolve these tensions. It allows them to coexist, accumulating weight rather than meaning. This complexity deepens through the film's feminist dimension. The Shakers dismantled traditional gender hierarchies whilst imposing strict bodily discipline. Women hold symbolic authority, yet that authority is inseparable from deprivation. Power is present, but it comes at the cost of autonomy. Fastvold captures this contradiction without commentary. Anne Lee's leadership feels both empowering and suffocating. Her authority is real, but so is the isolation it demands. This isn't feminism delivered as messaging. It emerges from lived conditions, shaped by belief and limitation rather than ideology. The unease in the film doesn't come from spectacle, it comes from sincerity. From the calm certainty of people who believe absolutely. From the way silence can feel less like peace and more like pressure. In a cinematic landscape obsessed with escalation, Fastvold finds dread in restraint. Viewed alongside Fastvold's collaboration with her real-life husband and creative partner Brady Corbett, the film becomes part of a larger inquiry into idealism. Whereas the duo's output from last year, The Brutalist, examined ambition through material permanence, steel, concrete, legacy, The Testament of An Lee explores devotion as its inverse, a pursuit of transcendence that demands sacrifice rather than empire. 2024's effort built outward, whereas this year's release turns inward. Both ask the same question: what does it cost to devote your life to an idea? All of this is amplified by the film's audiovisual design. Shot on film, the grain feels tactile rather than nostalgic. Candlelit interiors glow with a warmth that borders on the sacred. Winter landscapes stretch into quiet desolation, evoking purity and isolation in equal measure. Sound functions like architecture. Footsteps become the beat. Choral echoes linger long after the image cuts away, and silence acquires weight. This is a film designed for immersion, not consumption. Its scale is intimate, but the details are vast. And I think this is exactly why it demands a theatrical experience. Not for spectacle, but for presence. For the sense of being surrounded by a world that does not bend itself to you. Summing it up, The Testament of An Lee is historical without being museum-like, spiritual without being preachy, psychological without being clinical. It treats contradiction not as something to resolve, but as something to inhabit. A story that could have been static becomes hypnotic. A woman who could have been forgotten becomes unforgettable. A community defined by restraint becomes a source of overwhelming emotion. Mona Fastvold doesn't ask us to worship or condemn, she asks us to witness. And in the act of witnessing, the film becomes something close to revelation.